We're at the top of the hour, but I'll wait for a few minutes. I expect more people to join, so let's wait a little bit more.
Hi, Hannes. Joseph.
Hey, hi, Mike.
Hi, Mike, everyone.
Hi, Mike. How's it going?
Joseph or Joe? Good. Pedro, hello.
Weird
Good.
formal that says Joseph there, but
Yeah.
Hi.
I'm used to you being Joe.
I have to change some settings somewhere, I guess. But
Just like I'm used to being Mike, except in writing, in which case I'm Michael.
sure.
By the way, Carsten just posted that we put somewhere we put in there, please don't share details of this publicly yet, because I think that's with this meeting we crossed that line, I guess.
Joseph and I understand that. We'll talk about that once we're formally convened.
Okay, so I think we are ready to go. Let's get going. Okay. Okay. Welcome everyone. Let's get going. As a reminder, not well applies here. This governs everything that we do at IETF. So if you're unfamiliar with this, please make sure to read more about this and educate yourself. This is important. Another reminder, the OAUTH security workshop is next month. If you're interested, I think registration is still open. Daniel, I think.
Yes.
Is that correct? Okay.
Registration is still open, although at some point we cannot guarantee that you will get access to the social events as well, because we have a number of registration already. And we have the preliminary schedule online now, just a few minutes ago.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Okay. So this is our last interim of this long series of interims. We'll talk about private key JWT issue. So Joseph and Mike will be driving. We ask you to hold your questions till the end. Let them first walk through the whole presentation. Shouldn't take long. And then at the end, we'll open it for questions. So that's for this presentation. Few comments before we hand it to Joseph and Mike. We would like to, Hannes and I would like to get your feedback on this series of interims. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, I'm not talking about right now, like you can send us an email or send us a message and DM, and if you want to chat about this and provide any feedback, we would love to hear from you guys. Another one is in the coming IETF meeting in Bangkok, we will have 2 sessions instead of the 3 typical sessions that we have, because we've done all this series of interims. So if you have any topics that we'll discuss, make sure to reach out to Hannes and myself as soon as possible. Okay, so that's all I have on my side. I'm gonna stop sharing and hand it to Joseph. You'll be starting. Let me see if I can share.
Thanks.
Give you control.
Great, thank you.
Are you able to share?
Is that the wrong Joseph?
No, it's the right Joseph. Oh, sorry. How about now? It was the wrong Joseph.
There are two Josephs. Yeah, let this be a
Yeah.
lesson to those that think identity is easy.
Shit. Okay, hold on.
Yeah, that was quite appropriate for.
How about now, Joseph? There
Okay,
you go.
that's looking better.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rifat. Welcome, everyone. So yeah, myself and Mike Jones are going to talk about this issue that we've discovered in. Sorry, it wasn't us that discovered it, but we're going to talk about an issue that was found with private key jar. And I'm afraid this is absolutely my prettiest slide. They go downhill very fast from here, and this one isn't particularly pretty. So yeah, sorry. This is a potential security vulnerability in the protocol, so we're asking people to not make a big deal of this at this point. So please don't go writing blogs and press releases about this kind of stuff. Just because we want to make sure that people have a chance to address the issue and think about it before it hits the press or anything like that. We don't want to unnecessarily panic people because it's probably not a big issue and probably won't affect most people.
Joseph,
Yep.
we automatically, these meetings are recorded and put on YouTube. So
Yep.
like, don't make a big fuss about it, don't write about it. It's probably
Yeah, I appreciate there's absolutely a limit of what we can do. We're not sharing the actual academic paper at this point to avoid to just do what we can to try and limit the exposure whilst people have a chance to understand what kind of thing they might need to do and what kind of situation it might apply in. To date, I don't think we've found any live ecosystems that are actually vulnerable to this, but that doesn't mean that there isn't one somewhere. So we just want to avoid panicking people. So, but yeah, as Hannes says, this session is public. We're fully aware of that. It's going on YouTube. You know, the slides are already public. There's a limit to how much we can control this, but yeah, just to ask people to be as responsible as they can with the information would be appreciated. But yeah, it is very much public at this point. So this vulnerability. Oh, sorry.
So yeah, just there is Joseph in the queue, but like, can you please hold on the questions till the end?
Sure. Yeah, we'll follow up about the way to disclose this properly.
Okay.
So, so this was actually found during a security analysis of OpenID Federation that was done by the University of Stuttgart. So I think we have Pedram and Tim on the line. I don't know, we've got Ralph, have we? So that's great. I think usual OpenID Foundation policy is that we do security analysis of our specifications before they go public to try and flesh out details like this. This particular one that they found, when they found it, we realized that it actually has potentially wider ecosystems impact than just Federation. So once we spotted that, we started discussing it more widely with the authors of the specifications that are affected, some of the ecosystems that potentially meet some of the preconditions to being vulnerable, but probably not all of them. And as I say, to the ones we've looked at to date, the people we've spoken to, nobody has said, oh yeah, we're absolutely vulnerable to this. Everybody seems good today. And this call today is just part of widening the disclosure. So yeah, we've tried to keep it under wraps up to this point, just to give some of the ecosystems that we knew about that were potentially vulnerable the chance to do things without panicking. But obviously, to actually update OAuth specs and things, we have to start talking about this kind of thing publicly now, and that's what we're doing today. So Mike's going to stick a link in a chat that actually contains the full academic paper. This is the main thing we're actually asking people not to share public, just because it essentially contains enough that you'd be able to actually run the exploit if you found a vulnerable ecosystem.
Yeah, don't put it into the chat then, because that actually did already. The link will also be included as part of the recording. Justin said that. Okay.
Yeah.
We understand that, but that said, it's not fair to the working group to ask them to make changes to specifications without being able to truly understand why. And so, you know, we know we're crossing the threshold from confidential to public by doing this, but we can't, you know, submit OAuth spec changes and ask people to be good with them without being able to understand. Thank you.
Yeah, so we are trying to walk a delicate line here and definitely not claiming we're getting this right. By contrast, the IETF security vulnerability disclosure policy says, please post the vulnerability to the public mailing list on day one, which also didn't seem appropriate. So yeah, we're just trying to walk a line. And I think feedback about whether we walked the right line or not and went too far, not far enough, I think would be appreciated at some point, because maybe the IETF shouldn't have a policy that says you should post security vulnerabilities onto the public mailing list as soon as you find them. But that's obviously a much bigger discussion.
Yeah. Yeah, we're probably discussing this somewhere else, but yeah. Keep going, Joseph. Yes.
Great, thanks. So try and set some of the history here. I think Brian sometimes tells this story better than I do, but private key JWT is unfortunately historically not greatly defined. So RFC 7523, the main one that actually defines it, says the OAuth value must be a claim containing a value that identifies the authorization server as an intended audience, and the token endpoint URL may be used, which is really not saying anything that's great for interoperability to start with, unfortunately. Something we've wrestled with in the OpenID Foundation conformance suites for some of this stuff. And because it's only a claim containing a value, you can actually shove multiple values in there. So theoretically, a client could be minting private key JWT client authentication assertions where it just puts the OAuth value as an array that contains every AS it might ever want to talk to and is sending that to all ASs. And there's all kinds of ways that could go wrong. Anyway, an OpenID Connect is kind of similarly vague, maybe slightly stronger. It actually says it should be the authorization server's token endpoint, but it just has this vague, the authorization server must verify that it's an intended audience for the token. So again, that's kind of doesn't really tell an authorization server what to do, unfortunately. So this problem has been batting around for a while, and PAR did try to tackle it. So this is the text from the PAR pushed authorization request specification. So this one at least says, hey, you should accept the issuer identifier URL as well, but for interoperability, you must accept the issuer identifier, the token endpoint URL, which is the one that the previous specs mentioned, or the actual endpoint URL that the value's been sent to, as values that identify yourself as the intended audience. But it still leaves other things open, like if you can have multiple values in the array and that kind of thing. And then other specs that use JWTs that are within the OAuth specs space say other things. So JAR, for example, says that signed JAR request objects should contain the ISS and OAuth members, and the OAuth value should be the value of the AS issuer. But again, a lot of shoulds, and I wasn't blaming you for JAR, Brian. Don't worry. Because yeah, this isn't about private key JWT either, but it's different ways we've used JWT. And again, the language here of shoulds is not necessarily great for interoperability and testing and all that kind of thing. So just to try and explain the basics of the attack, so we've got something on record that everybody understands, and we can start talking about solutions, hopefully. So I'm going to use an open banking ecosystem as this example. So hopefully everybody's familiar with what an open banking ecosystem looks like. You have a whole bunch of fintechs, you have a whole bunch of banks. Pretty much all the fintechs want to talk to all the banks. And some of these systems have like central directories that actually assign client IDs so that they're consistent across all the banks, or allow certificates to or keys to be distributed, etc., etc. And that's some of those things are one of the preconditions for the attack, which I'll talk about in a minute. But just to go through, so what happens on the top right, we've got an attacker-controlled bank authorization server. And in that authorization server, the attacker publishes the token endpoint as being the issuer URL for the real bank's authorization server that's at the bottom right-hand corner. And then what the attacker does is they initiate a session at this entity on the left, which is a legitimate fintech. So the attacker's not doing anything unusual here. They're just starting a session as a normal user. That results in the fintech sending a private key JOT client assertion to the PAR endpoint of the attacker's bank, with the odds set to the real bank's issuer URL. And what that means is that then the attacker has a private key JOT assertion that they can replay to the real AS to authenticate as that client. So that's the problem, essentially, that because you've got the assertion coming into the PAR endpoint, but it's got the token endpoint as the OAUTH value, and you've got that mismatch where it's not the URL that the assertion is being sent to that's actually in the OAUTH. So by having the assertion sent to the PAR endpoint and then picking the token endpoint as the value that's actually used, and having that token endpoint actually pointing at an issuer, you end up in this situation where the attacker gets this assertion that it shouldn't have. So there's a couple of requirements to actually really be able to perform this attack, which is why nobody's actually vulnerable. So quite a few of the open banking ecosystems have used MTLS in addition to private key JOT when they've used it. And then in addition to that, they require that the MTLS certificate actually matches the client ID. And that obviously prevents it, because if you need to present an MTLS certificate, you can't replay that then. Another big one is that the attacker actually needs to have control of a bank, essentially, that is trusted by the fintech. And again, that's a pretty high bar. You would hope that all these ecosystems are fairly tightly regulated, and it shouldn't be easy for the attacker to gain control of a bank or enroll their own fake bank into the ecosystem and then actually have the fintech trust it and start sending their users to it without some control somewhere going in place. Obviously, when you've got a whole federation, that's a slightly different topic, which is why this came up in the context of the OpenID federation specification. To pull off the attack, you probably need more than at least 2 endpoints with client authentication. The PAR and the token endpoint are the obvious cases, but it's not impossible. You could do something using the revocation endpoint, or CBER endpoint, or the device code endpoint, anything that has client authentication. You could essentially perhaps come up with a way to do this thing, but you definitely need that 2 endpoint state, because you need an endpoint that you can trick the fintech into using as the OAUTH, and a different endpoint that the assertion is actually sent to so that you can capture it. The client ID needs to be the same across both authorization servers. Again, that's the one that gets a bit more problematic. If you think about non-open banking use cases, it's very unusual to have consistent client IDs across different authorization servers. In open banking ecosystems, some of them do it deliberately. And even when it's not happening deliberately, there might be ways that the attacker, if they have control of a bank, can actually influence the client IDs issued, so that the client ID that's been used at the legitimate bank is actually used at the attacker's bank as well. So that gets complicated to figure out if you're vulnerable to that point. The latest implementers draft of FAPI 2, which I think is actually a year or 2 old now when I say latest, that actually requires that the client send the audience value as the issuer instead of the token endpoint URL. So that completely prevents the attack. And that's why this problem didn't come up when the security analysis of FAPI was done. And what we're seeing is, since we started talking to some ecosystems about this, some of them are planning to ask their banks to actually start rejecting private key JOT client assertions if the audience value isn't the issuer. And that technically doesn't prevent the attack, because it's only the client sending the correct an assertion that only has the correct value in it that actually prevents the attack. But it is a kind of way to hopefully catch misconfigured clients and force them to be configured correctly, and then hopefully they behave correctly with all the banks, and then everything is good. But it is, I think I lost my train of thought there. Yeah, it's not technically a full mitigation, but it does help, and we're not quite sure on the timescales of when people are actually going to roll that out. But it can definitely help. I think I'm going to pass over to Mike at this point. Do you want to take over the slide, Mike? Or
I'm not actually sure how to advance the slides, so maybe I'll
just say next slide. Yeah.
Say next. Okay. This vulnerability was discovered a little bit before IETF in Dublin. We convened an ad hoc group, including the OAUTH chairs and the editors of the specifications that we believed were potentially affected, and had some discussions about, well, so we have a vulnerability, what do we do? Around a table in Dublin over a couple days. And after the first one, I was given the assignment to describe concisely, well, what could we do about it? One was that we could have the audience be the issuer identifier in all cases. That aligns with the more recent OAuth specs, like the ISS spec, and it also aligns with FAPI2 and OpenID Federation. But it requires updates to some specs, although you'll notice that all the mitigations require update to some specs. In particular, it requires updates to some software using private key JOT. We also talked about, well, we could double down on the audience being the token or a target endpoint, like the token endpoint or the PAR endpoint or what have you. And in fact, as Joseph said, PAR requires you to accept all three at present. Or we could even invent a new claim and kind of sidestep the audience, leave audience ambiguous and do an unambiguous thing in the new claim. Next. The solution that gained consensus among those having the discussion was to use the issuer identifier as the audience value for tokens sent to the authorization endpoint. You'll recall that this was introduced by the metadata spec 8414, and it provides a single unambiguous identifier for the authorization server. And I'll note, it's already used that way by many of the more recent specs. PAR, it's required to accept that. It's used in JAR, although with a should. It's a must in FAPI2. It's a must in OpenID Federation. It's used as the value of the ISS parameter, which is now a couple of years old. And Philippe Skokin, I don't know if Philippe's here, but he gets credit for an innovation saying, well, for compatibility reasons, it's useful to be able to know whether you're kind of in the old world before things are cleaned up, or in the new world where the audience is much more tightened, and we propose to do that with explicit typing. Next. So I'm going to, at fairly lightning speed, go through all the specs that we believe are potentially affected. One slide per spec. Next. So the one right in the center of this is the JOT assertion spec, where the private key JOT and the client authentication, as well as the JOT assertion grant, are defined. And the audience for both is really vague. It may be the token endpoint URL, and multiple audiences are allowed, which facilitates attacks. I and others have worked on a proposed BIS document, where BIS is an IETF term for document that replaces an old one. This is on my GitHub. It requires that the AS issuer identifier be the only audience value. And it replaces 7523 in IETF terminology, as well as updating several other specs, which I'll talk about next. So 7523 built on the assertion framework, 7521, it has the ambiguous audience language. We propose that the 7523 BIS updates 7521 by replacing a paragraph, and the paragraph is in 7523 BIS. Next. Similarly, 7522, our favorite, SAML assertions. I know that's one of Brian's favorites. Also has the same ambiguous audience language. And the current proposed 7523 BIS document tightens that language. Next. OpenID Connect Core, one of my favorites, also has not fully tight audience language. It says it should be the URL of the AS's token endpoint. On the other hand, when we did the JAR spec, we updated that to be the AS's issuer identifier. So there's a conflict between core and the OAuth specs already as they exist, which this would sort out. There's also a published proposed errata update document for OpenID Connect Core available. Next. FAPI1 requires that the issuer identifier be one of the audience values, but multiple values are allowed. The FAPI editors have worked on a proposed errata update to that spec that makes it that the only audience allowed is the issuer identifier. Next. As Joseph explained, FAPI2, already the previous implementers draft required that the issuer identifier be the only audience. This is now in review to become final within a small number of weeks. The good news is that the editors preserved that language between the last implementers draft and the proposed final draft, so the audience is unambiguous. Next. OpenID Federation was the security analysis thereof, which discovered this property or the vulnerability in the first place. And Tim and Pedram, who did some of this analysis, are on the call, and I expect they'll be answering some questions shortly. The Federation authors updated it to tighten the audience, and that's in place. Thank you. Next. Client-initiated back-channel authentication, or CIBA core, in the Minerta working group of the OpenID Foundation had the same kind of rambling audience language as PAR. I don't know which one wrote it first. Joe DeCock, who's on the call, of Duende Software, volunteered to update that, which he did. to tighten the audience, and a editor's draft of that has been published. Next. The OAuth jar has the should, which really should be a must. The 7523 bis proposes to update it. That's not a breaking change, but it's still a tightening in line with everything else. Next. Finally, the last thing that the 7523 bis proposes to update is the pushed authorization request, or PAR. Again, changing it from currently mandating accepting 3 different audience values to mandating that it only accept 1. Next. The last spec I'm going to talk about is our friend, the in-progress OAuth security BCP. And some of you have probably been wondering, what's taking the RFC editor so long about that? It is not the RFC editor, it is us. Because a new actionable security vulnerability was found that applies to OAuth, we believed that it would be appropriate to have the discussion in the working group about, do we insert a new clause describing that vulnerability and the mitigation in the security BCP? And Daniel Fett had asked me to take a stab at that. I did so. There's a link to the new proposed section text in the slide. Thank you. Next. Okay, next steps. And we're almost there for discussion time. I plan to publish the 7523 bis after the call, and I'll ask if the chairs would like to run an adoption call for it. I'm not asking you to answer that till we're done with the next couple slides. Note that this is a starting point for a bunch of security mitigations. It doesn't mean that it has to stay exactly the way it is, and there's things that some people may desire to change, which is fine. I also plan to publish a draft of the OpenID Connect Core errata update after the call. We could publish the CIBA Core update. I need to consult with the Moderna editors and chairs to make sure that they're good with that now that this is in the open. Next. Okay, one of the most important questions is there anybody else you know of that's running an OAuth-based ecosystem that might be vulnerable to this attack? And you may want to review the precursor conditions that Joseph helpfully wrote down for us and are actually written down in much more detail in the document I linked to in the chat. So for instance, there were some open banking ecosystems that, while no attacks occurred, they are changing to utilize the new recommendations, which some of them previously had not been, to close the door in case a trusted bank ever does become part of the vulnerability. An important sort of editorial question for this working group is 7523 bis, as written, currently replaces 7523 and makes fairly surgical updates to 4 other specs. That's probably easier to review, which is why we wrote it that way. The working group could decide that it would be cleaner to have separate drafts that are BIS drafts to update or to replace everything we're updating. So for instance, you could decide not to update PAR in 7523 bis. You could decide to update PAR in a 9126 bis. That's a largely editorial change from what we have, but it's in the purview of the working group to refactor this if they choose. The other question, which I know Daniel and the other authors were eager to hear your feedback on, is do we describe the vulnerability and the mitigation in the security BCP before we hit publish, or not hit publish, before we make it an RFC and remove it from the RFC editor queue? And this is just me personally, feeling was this draft is about describing vulnerabilities and mitigations, and given we know of an important one, we should do it, but others mileage may vary. Next. All right, as we promised Rafat, we got through this in just over half the time. I've not been trying to follow the chat while talking, but let's run the queue. Thank you.
Okay. Justin.
All right. Oh, hang on.
Justin.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep. Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. It was asking for devices that are not plugged in. All right. So I want to tackle, Mike, if you could go back, or Joseph, if you could go back to the previous slide for the questions. I want to tackle these in reverse order. Yeah, that one. First, pausing the security BCP every time there's a security problem means that we're never going to have a security BCP, right? The whole idea with the BCP is that it's best current practices, and at the time that the working group decided to publish it, those were the best current practices. It was current then, and if we need to revise that, let's do a revision of that in parallel with getting this out the door finally after many iterations of trying to make this thing go, right? We're treating it like a wiki page. It's not. It should go to an RFC and then be replaced by another RFC very soon if we need to. Which brings me to the second point on here, and that's that I think that having BIS documents that separate each of the pieces of functionality actually makes a whole lot more sense than one document that says, oh, hey, go read the rest of that other document, but when you read this line, actually it's this. Do the patch here. Yes, that is potentially more work for the working group. However, we have a habit in the IETF of treating the document process of as soon as we open a document for edits, then all bets are off and everything needs to change in here, and then it's going to take 3 years before we see anything out the door. That doesn't actually have to happen. We actually have the choice to decide how much change we want to put into a BIS document and how quickly we want to do it. So if we wanted to do this, I think, Mike, you identified 4 documents, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, plus the one we're actually replacing.
Right. So for each of those documents.
And you can see those in the published editor's draft.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. So to replace all of those documents as a family of like, hey, these are the updated versions of all of these, that doesn't need to be a long process if we keep it scoped to just these changes. Now, the big problem is that this working group has historically not been the best about sticking to scope, as we're seeing with the security BCP, right? Because as soon as we open up the door to those, somebody's going to say, well, actually, I also wanted to change this other thing in this, and it's going to be 3 to 4 years later by the time we actually get it out the door. So I think that as a disciplined working group, we could actually have a much better path if we so choose. We have historically not done that. I hope we make a better choice this time. As to the top one, I don't know of any.
Okay, thanks, Justin. Daniel.
Yeah, so I wanted to add something. So essentially what Justin said on the security BCP and scope and so on, right? So for me, the outcome of this call ideally would be an idea whether the working group wants to add something to the security BCP or not, because technically the co-authors and I can trigger the publication at any time. So it's really in the last state of the RFC editing process. And if there's no appetite for adding anything here, then I would certainly welcome that. We've spent a lot of time adding stuff to the security BCP. As Justin said, people will want to add other stuff as well. And in fact, there's another security vulnerability that has been published that affects certain ecosystems. And those authors have already also approached us and asking whether we can add text to the security BCP or not. So yeah, we can have a follow-up, like an update to the security BCP later on. So I propose to do any changes in a second revision of that security BCP.
Okay, thanks, Danielle. Brian.
I think the concern about scope creep is real, and I am of the opinion that the proposed document already massively oversteps the necessary scope to address the problem, and I am worried then that it will get hung up in discussions around why and what and the details that it doesn't even need to do in order to address the specific security concern. In particular, JAR doesn't need to be touched. Authorization grants don't need to be touched. And the implication of changing those is both significant churn and discussion and time delays in the working group to do it, and introducing interoperability and compatibility issues in the field for no reason, because they are not related to the actual security discussion. So
Brian, just to make sure I'm clear, so you're saying let the security BCP continue right now, right? Like don't hold it, right?
Sorry, I was on a, yes, I was actually talking about these documents itself, but I agree with that too. The BCP should just go forward.
Okay. Okay. And okay. Sorry, maybe then I missed your point. So do you want to maybe rephrase it a little bit? Yeah.
Okay, BCP proceeds, no changes. If people feel it's important to cover in the BCP, then start a new one. I don't think it's necessary, but whatever. BC proceeds. Some work here in a 7523 BIS should proceed, but it needs to be much smaller in the scope of the changes that it introduces than what's in the draft that Mike's proposing that he publish, and then you immediately start working or adoption calls on. It's much too broad. It's going to cause a lot of problems and slow things down.
Yeah, we haven't decided on doing anything at this point, right? So you're saying that 7523 BIS is too broad, and you think that those changes should be addressed in different documents, similar to what Justin was talking about before?
No, I actually think I think 7523 BIS is an okay way to do it. I acknowledge that it's a bit awkward to do those kinds of updates, but I think it probably makes sense in just one. But I think the scope of the proposed changes in the proposed 7523 BIS document are much too broad.
I see. Okay. Okay. Anything else, Brian?
Not at this time. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Joseph. We can't hear you, Joseph.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Tale as old as time. Sorry. So I wanted to follow up and ask about the request to not disclose this. So I work on Identity Server, this framework for building OAuth and OpenID Connect services, and so we'd like to patch this. We'd like to release a new release of Identity Server tomorrow to say, you know, have strict audience validation or something like that, and we'd like to explain why we're doing it. And that seems to run counter to that ask. So yeah, I guess my question to the group is, how do we how do we fix this vulnerability without saying we're fixing it, or how do we talk about this in a good way? Yeah, Mike?
Okay, go ahead, Mike. Yeah.
What Joseph and I had proposed to do in terms of a compromise on this is to, be willing to tell people that this closes a security vulnerability in the protocols that was found. But for the time being, unless there's a need to know, not pointing them to the actual detailed description of how to exercise the vulnerability, how to create an attack. Mm-hmm. That does require a certain amount of trust from your customers. But here, you can do like we've just done here. You can point them to the thing that actually makes the attack actionable, but ask them not to, post it on Twitter or what have you.
Okay. And because I wanted to post it on Twitter that we were making a release, or Blue Sky,
right.
Whatever.
And you can post that you're making a release, but I wouldn't draw attention to the fact that it's because of a security vulnerability. Just like, there was a FAPI2 change made and an OpenID Federation change made because of the security vulnerability. We didn't say that's why we were changing it. We just said we were tightening the audience validation rules, which were currently ambiguous. We didn't say how bad it being ambiguous is.
Okay.
Okay, that's not why I queued, but that's all right. Okay. That's important.
Anything else, Joseph, from your side?
Yeah,
you good?
Well, if I can maybe just add on to that. I mean, one option you have for saying why you're doing this change is this. It's just for compatibility with FAPI2 final, which requires this behavior, basically. FAPI2 final does have a clause that actually requires the AS to enforce. So that's an easy way of explaining why you're making the change without necessarily drawing attention to it being a security issue that needs further explanation.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Mike.
Sure. I wanted to thank Brian for thinking this through. Brian and I did have a discussion before this, so at least we knew where each of us was coming from. In terms of whether, in particular, let's just focus on the question of, do we update the audience for the assertion grant? 7523 defines two kinds of JOT tokens, and the audience language for them both is the same. When I created the 7523 BIS, I maintained that property, that the audience language for both remained the same. It's just for both it changed. Now, it's a legitimate question whether there's a security problem with the assertion grant or not. This is why I'm glad I have Tim and Pedram on the call, because we ask them in a private channel dedicated to this vulnerability whether the vulnerability can apply to other kinds of JOTs, in particular the assertion grant, that can be sent to the authorization server? And the short answer was yes. The long answer is much longer than that. And Brian, before he even gets there, will assert that I believe that it's not actually actionable in practice. What I tried to do editorially when creating these things and working with other working groups like FAPI and Moderna that did create them as well was to consistently have the audience validation for any token sent to the server be the same as a simplification. And ironically, to Brian's point about doing this fast, I think part of being able to do it fast is being able to explain it simply and have the rules applied be simple. Where I don't think it's simple if you have one audience validation rule for one kind of token and a different for another. But again, this is why we have a working group, and this is why we have implementer feedback, and I will stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Justin.
Yeah, just a quick clarification and to repeat something that I said in the chat. We can do a quick BIS with the BCP since there are several items that are already queued up in order to actually give the working group a chance to chew on those appropriately. I do not think it is appropriate for the editors to add things after working group last call that are substantial or substantive additions to the document, and adding language on an entire new attack is exactly that. So because this is a BCP, we should treat it like a BCP and publish it and update it as soon as we can. If we had to get in, an annual shot with the new OAuth BCP, security BCP every year, that wouldn't be bad for the community, quite honestly.
Okay, thanks, Justin. And Philip.
Thank you, Rifat. I'd like to kind of respond to Joseph, the other Joseph from Identity Server. Sorry, Joseph, not to confuse anyone here. I would just like to mention one thing that was repeated to me several times throughout the earlier closer circle of disclosure. The authorization server change is not what closes the vulnerability. You do not need to go tomorrow and change your authorization server saying, hey, we fixed the vulnerability. The fix in here, and I feel like this is something that should have been mentioned in the presentation, is clients doing the right thing, not the authorization server complaining that the audience is being sent in an array rather than a simple string. So there is no need to rush the authorization server changes. We need to change the clients to do the right thing first, and kind of allow a transition between post 7523 BIS and before, with something like JWT tip or type detection, allow both for a while and then disallow the one, and that's when you enable strict validation. But the actual fix is changing the client, not anything on the server.
I confess that I don't fully understand that. If the client does the wrong thing and the server accepts it, then you have the vulnerability. If the server rejects it, then you don't.
The client can do the right thing today, and with the change, you will still you will reject it.
So I think the problem is as an authorization server, you don't know which value the client intended to use. You just know which value you received. So if we go back to my diagram, I can do that quickly. So yeah, the real bank AS does not know it's under attack. So making a change to the real bank AS doesn't actually technically prevent anything. as I say, there is some sense to making that change to have the AS reject clients that are behaving wrongly, because that hopefully then means the kind of set of clients in the ecosystem that are behaving correctly increases. But it's not a direct link. It's the thing that actually prevents the attack in the mathematical model is the client doing the right thing.
Brian wrote it perfectly in chat. And I'll quote him there. The authorization server changes kind of help flushing out the clients that are not doing the right thing, but it is not the fix. You can enforce the new rules if you can detect that the client has been updated or hasn't, and it has been enough time. But until you have those in place, like a client that gets updated and includes a JW tip, up until then, you just don't know.
Okay. Thanks, Philip. That's great. Joseph, is that clear? Like, or you still have some questions about the issue here? I'm still seeing you puzzled a little bit, but we're gonna go ahead.
I don't want to take up the whole working group's time.
Okay.
So
So maybe you can.
There is also there's also the document that was shared in the chat.
Right. So you can take a look at that.
So to digest some of this.
Yeah. Perfect. Mike, and after that, I want to do a summarization here. Questions. Okay. Go ahead, Mike.
First, I wanted to thank Philip for explaining that the client has to do the right thing to close the attack. That's an important detail that the security researchers informed us of. It is the case with a few of the specs that we have to do updates to enable the client to do the right thing. In particular, OpenID Connect Core says that the audience should be the token endpoint URL, where if we're asserting that the right thing is to always use the issuer identifier, that's a change. So that's what the proposed errata does. So it's not that we have to rush things, but we do have to enable clients to do the right things. And again, I thank Philippe for suggesting using explicit typing so that you can tell whether the client has moved on to the tightened world. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, so I want to tackle the question about security BCP first, because I think it's probably fairly easy answer there. So it seems that the feeling I'm getting that is we don't want to hold that document anymore. Let it go, and we will deal with new issues in a future document. Anybody has any argument against doing that? I don't see anybody in the queue here, but if somebody has an issue with this, please speak up. Unless we hear anything, something from you now, we'll probably let it go, right? So, okay, so that's that. I don't see anybody in the queue, so we probably will let the security BCP proceed from here, right? We're not gonna hold it back. Okay, good. So that's that. The other question is that 7523 biz. It seems that the feeling I'm getting is still some questions about the proper scope of the document is still kind of debatable. So, and maybe Mike, next step is maybe for you to publish it as an individual document and then push it to the mailing list, and then have that discussion before we call for adoption. Is that fair? Okay, I can't hear you, but I think you're agreeing with me. Yeah, perfect. And that's, I think, covers the things that I wanted to talk about. Any other topic? Hannes, did I miss anything?
No, that was very good. What we didn't manage to get to is a little bit of a a post-mortem analysis to hear how we can avoid these type of mistakes in the future. That's something I still want to do in a future meeting. But I also want to thank everyone who was participating in the discussion for the great collaboration and for working this out and creating comparisons, talking to customers, etc., etc. I think that was wonderful. Worked really well. So happy about that. Thank you.
100%. I agree with that. Mike, last
That's all I wanted to say is a tremendous amount of work has gone into getting us to this point.
Okay.
And you know who you are. I thank each of you who've already contributed.
Awesome. Yeah, we appreciate all your hard work.
And also
lots of work behind the scenes for sure.
And thank you also for helping us and Roman, he's not on the call. We obviously talked to them about finding out whether there's a possibility for accelerated publication of these BIS documents. So sort of our leadership is in great support of doing that and jumping queues here and there. Once we found out what we actually want, what the right scope is and so on, and that will be discussed on the minutes. Just a quick shout out to those Deb and Roman as well.
Yeah. Okay. Any last minute comment from anybody else? Okay. Thank you all. That concludes all of our interims, and hopefully we'll see you in Bangkok. See you guys. Bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye.